welcome to today's On This Day in Tudor History. I'm Claire Ridgway, which you probably know now because I've been doing these every day since January the 1st. But if you don't know me, I run the Tudor Society and also the Anne Boleyn Files websites. And I'm also author of several history books, including this one, On This Day in Tudor History, which is where I've got the inspiration for doing these videos from. Now, we haven't had any executions for a few days, so I thought we'd go back to the bloody and brutal times of the Tudors by offering you executions today. And actually, I've got two for you today, so yes, not very nice. For it was on this day in Tudor history, the 13th of March 1601, so right at the end of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, that Henry Cuffe and Sir Gelly Meyrick, and I love that name, Gelly, it's brilliant, were hanged at Tyburn in London for their part in Essex's Rebellion of February 1601. I'll give you a link to read, I'll give you a link to my video, which I did on the execution of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, because it was him that led Essex's rebellion. You can find out more about it in that video. Now, Henry Cuffe had served as secretary to Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and Merrick had been the Earl's steward. So that's how they kind of got tangled up in the mess of February 1601. Essex himself had been executed by beheading on the 25th of February 1601. But I thought I'd actually sort of introduce you a bit more to these men because no one's heard of Henry Cuffe and Sir Gelly Meyrick, have they? Tell you a bit more about them and how they got embroiled in this apart from being employees of the Earl of Essex. Henry Cuffe was a scholar, in fact, a classical scholar. He hailed from Somerset originally. He'd been born around 1562, 1563. Of course, I always say around because most Tudor people, we don't really know their dates. We only know their dates of birth if they're important, like if they're a royal, because then it's recorded in chronicles and dispatches. But you didn't actually have to record births and things like that at this stage in the Tudor period. Now, he was educated at Trinity College, Oxford, after securing the patronage of Lady Elizabeth Paulet, and he graduated from that college with a Bachelor of Arts before becoming a Fellow of the college. He then moved to Merton College, becoming a Fellow there in 1586. He took his MA at Merton. Then in 1590, he was appointed as Regius Professor of Greek at Merton, and he was one chosen to deliver a speech for Queen Elizabeth I on her visit to Oxford in 1592. He served as the university proctor in between 1593 and 1594, just for a year, and then he moved into the service of Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, becoming one of the Earl's secretaries. He had quite a few secretaries, so Henry Cuffe became one of them. Now, as the Earl's secretary, he accompanied him on his expedition to Cadiz in Spain in 1596. He carried out missions for the Earl, going to Florence and also Paris. And it was in Paris that he struck up a friendship with one of the Earl's close friends, Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. In 1599, he accompanied Essex on his rather fateful mission to Ireland after Essex was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. It was Cuffe who was sent by the Earl back to England to argue Essex's case to the Queen after there had been, after the Queen was being told that Essex was doing a bad job in Ireland and he wasn't obeying her instructions. He was sort of making agreements with the rebels there without authority. And so it was Cuffe who went back and who sort of argued in defence of Essex. And Cuffe carried on as Essex's secretary after the Earl's arrest and confinement. He was put under house arrest because of all the trouble following his return from Ireland. So that gives you a bit of background on Henry Cuffe. Now we move on to Sir Gelly Meyrick. I just love that name. I'm going to keep saying that. He was born in around 1556. He was the eldest son of Roland Merrick, who was the Bishop of Bangor. Now, his wonderful name of Gelly, and that was his name, came from his grandfather's estate. I think it was his maternal grandfather's estate, Gelliswick. So the name Gelly came from that. He was named after that estate in Wales. Now, following his father's death, the 9-year-old Gelly entered the service of George Devereux, who was the Earl of Essex's uncle, and he was based in Pembrokeshire in Wales. He then went on to serve the Earl of Essex, and he started serving him when the Earl was a student at Cambridge University in 1579. And Gelly became the man in charge of hiring the Earl's horses and looking after his horses, keeping his horses. When the Earl came of age, Merrick was obviously a trusted servant, and he moved from looking after the horses and that into managing the Earl's estates and his financial affairs. So he was obviously someone that the Earl could trust. His links to the Welsh gentry were also very important for the Earl. The Earl of Essex wanted to build a real power base in Wales, and so Gelly's links to important people in Wales were very useful for the Earl. And in return, Essex helped Merrick with building up lands and offices, putting him forward for royal kind of rewards. Now, Gelly accompanied his, I keep calling him Gelly instead of Merrick because I just like saying Gelly. Gelly accompanied his master warring in France and Cadiz. He was in charge of organising supplies. And after the capture of Cadiz in 1596, Gelly was knighted. So that's why he's known as Sir Gelly Meyrick. Henry Cuffe was just Henry Cuffe. He wasn't a knight, but Gelly was knighted. Like Cuffe, he accompanied Essex on the expedition to Ireland. And like Cuffe, he viewed the Earl's subsequent troubles as unfair. That the Earl was being blamed for everything that went wrong in Ireland, and he felt that it was the Earl's enemies that were trying to bring him down, and he wanted the Earl vindicated. Now, while some of Essex's supporters advised the Earl that he should, humble himself before the Queen and ask for the Queen's forgiveness for his actions, Cuffe, Gelly and the Earl of Southampton all encouraged Essex in the idea that, no, he shouldn't do that. What he should actually do is focus on removing his enemies at court, those who had spoken ill of him to the Queen while he was in Ireland. And according to William Camden, who's a contemporary source, Cuffe kept on at Essex, saying that he should resolve upon somewhat worthy of himself for the perfect recovery of his lost reputation and liberty, for the delivering of his friends from slavery, and the kingdom from the corrupt managery of certain persons. So Cuffe was really sort of pushing the Earl to take action. And it was then that the Earl apparently opened his doors at Essex House to all comers, and Gelly entertained these all comers at the Earl's table. They were described as all swordmen, bold, confident fellows, men of broken fortunes, discontented persons, and such as saucily used their tongues in railing against all men. So, the Earl was rallying people to his cause against those in the Queen's Council that he felt were his enemies. Essex also reached out to Scotland for the Scottish King's support, and Gelly began rallying Welsh support for the Earl. On the 7th of February 1601, the day before Essex's rebellion, Gelly Meyrick went to watch a performance of William Shakespeare's Richard II at the Globe Theatre with a group of the Earl of Essex's supporters. Now, the play had apparently been requested by Sir Charles Percy, but at his later trial, Gelly was accused of being in charge of it, of procuring it to be played, paying for it to be performed. For this was a play that was about the deposing of King Richard II. It was a play that was said to be bespoke by Gelly Meyrick. On the 8th of February 1601, Essex and his supporters marched out of Essex House to enter the city of London. On entry to the city, Essex cried out, for the Queen, a plot is laid for my life." Now, his plan was to force an audience with the Queen, to march through London with his supporters and soldiers and that, and to force an audience with the Queen. But instead of that happening, the Londoners closed their doors on him. They weren't interested in what was going on. This all failed. This rebellion failed, and he was denounced as a traitor. And historian Paul Hammer writes that Henry Cuffe, remained entirely aloof from the disaster, reading books and bewailing his master's precipitate action, and when he was arrested, claimed innocence. So I'll tell you a bit more about this in a few minutes, but that's apparently what Cuffe did. He wasn't one of the ones marching. Essex, however, accused Cuffe of being a principal instigator to these violent courses. So Cuffe may have been at home reading books, but he was blamed for being the one that was actually behind it all and the one that was instigating it and encouraging it. Now, Cuffe was tried for high treason with Sir Christopher Blunt, Sir Charles Danvers, Sir John Davis and Gelly at Westminster on the 5th of March 1601. At his trial, Cuffe said, "If my being within Essex House the day of the rebellion be a foundation to charge me with high treason, you may as well charge a lion that is within a grate with treason." But it was pointed out that he was there at Essex House on the day of this, amongst all this trouble, of his own volition. He didn't leave. Even he could have left if he was against the rebellion. And he was also accused at his trial of being the very seducer of the Earl. Now, the evidence against Gelly that proved him guilty of open rebellion was that he'd acted as captain or commander over the house, and that he'd been involved in fortifying and barricading the house and providing munitions for the Earl's men. So he was more than an instigator like Cuffe. He was actually taking action to help the rebellion. And it was alleged that he'd also removed some men from a property near Essex House and replaced them with some of the Earl's supporters. He was accused also of extorting protection money from Catholic recusants in Wales. Now, he didn't try to defend himself. Cuffe did. Cuffe sort of made out that, he was just sitting at home reading books and that he had nothing to do with it apart from just being in the house. But Gelly didn't try to defend himself. He said only, "I have little to say, but let what I have done be considered, and my offence will be found less than others. But the law hath adjudged it treason, and I must die, and not unwillingly. For the tree being fallen, the branches must not stand." Now, there he is obviously referring to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, having fallen. He's already been executed. He's dead and gone. So he was the tree, and now the branches, the other people that were involved in this rebellion, they too, have to go. Now, the jury went away to deliberate, and they found all of the men guilty. They were then all sentenced to death. Blunt and Danvers were sentenced to be beheaded on Tower Hill because they were nobly descended. So they were given the more merciful, sentence of being executed by the axeman. and the others were sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn. On the 13th of March 1601, Henry Cuffe and Sir Gelly Meyrick were drawn to the gallows at Tyburn. At the gallows, Cuffe gave a rather long speech, and he finished his speech by proclaiming his innocence. "But to come to the cause of my death, there is nobody here can possibly be ignorant what a wild commotion was raised on the 8th of February by a particular great but unadvised earl. I do call God, his angels, and my own conscience to witness that I was not in the least concerned therein, but was shut up that whole day within the house, where I spent the time in very melancholy reflections." Then, after an interruption, because he gave a rather long speech, and Merrick was one, Gelly was one who interrupted him because he just wanted him to get on with things, he carried on saying, "I confess it as a crime as black as treason for a subject who lost his prince's favour to force his way to the royal presence. For my own part, I never persuaded any man to take up arms against the Queen." And one account of his speech on the scaffold has him saying, well, actually it wasn't a scaffold, but it was a cart, has him saying, "I'm here adjudged to die, for plotting a plot never acted, and for acting an act never plotted." I quite like that one. That's quite a good speech. He carried on, but was interrupted again, and finally gave up on his speech and made a profession of his faith, asked pardon of God and of the Queen, and was then dispatched by the executioner. It was then Gelly's turn. His speech was very brief, but he used it to clear Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, of any involvement in the rebellion. The two men were then hanged. Now, they were actually allowed to die by hanging, by strangulation, rather than being cut down while they were still alive and disemboweled while still alive, because that's what hanging, drawing and quartering was. So at least there was the mercy that they didn't have to go through all the horrors of a traitor's death. Now, a bit of trivia about Henry Cuffe, because this is interesting trivia. Well, I find it interesting. Cuffe doesn't seem to have liked women very much. He never married. Gelly did. Cuffe didn't. And his biographer, Paul Hammer, notes that in his work, in the differences of the ages of man's life, he mentions women only in connection with the woman's treacherous seduction by the devil in the serpent, and also writes about their physical inferiority to men. He described sex as death's best harbinger and thought that the conservation of semen was good. So he didn't really have anything nice to say about women, and he chose not to marry. So I just thought that was an interesting insight into this man who, at his trial, said that he wasn't involved in the rebellion at all. He was just sat at home with his books and his melancholy reflections while his master marched on London. So today in history, the 13th of March 1601, Henry Cuffe and Sir Gelly Meyrick were hanged to death for their part in Essex's rebellion. So I'll give you a link to read all about the execution of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, who of course led Essex's rebellion. Thank you for joining me today. You can subscribe to the channel by clicking just around there. Give me a thumbs up if you've liked the video, and you can also hit the bell to be notified. I'm so glad that you're all enjoying my videos. It really makes my day to read your comments. Take care, and I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.